The night was cold, and a misty fog hung thick in the air. I, Jerry Schilling, Elvis's limo driver, swung by his apartment, and as we drove to the airport, I noticed something odd. Elvis, who usually looked like he was ready for a red carpet, was carrying a small cardboard box. I couldn't help but ask, "What's in the box, Elvis?" He smiled, but it was a tired smile. "Just some stuff for the trip," he said, opening the box to show me a toothbrush, toothpaste, a bar of soap, and a little wash rag. It was so unlike him, and I could tell something was off. When we got to the car, the fog made everything feel eerie. As I helped Elvis in, I noticed his face was all swollen, and he had a nasty rash on his neck. "Elvis, what happened?" I asked, genuinely worried. "It's just a bad reaction to penicillin," he said, his voice a bit hoarse. "We need to call a doctor right away." I was on the phone with the doctor, arranging a house call at 2:30 a.m., when Elvis started chatting up a flight attendant. He was always a charmer, but this time it felt different. He told me we had a stop to make. "Jerry, we got to take her by her place," he said, and I nodded, even though I knew we needed to get that doctor. We dropped the flight attendant off, and Elvis sat in the car, talking to her for an hour. I couldn't help but feel a bit frustrated, but I stayed quiet. When we finally got back, the doctor was already there, and he stayed all night, monitoring Elvis. I stayed up too worried sick. The next morning, Elvis looked better, and he announced we were heading to Washington. "Why are we going there?" I asked, but he just smiled and said, "You'll see." We drove to the Beverly Hills Hotel, where Elvis cashed a check for $500. We then headed to the airport, and as we boarded the plane, I noticed a heavy Christmas crowd. There were soldiers in uniform, returning from Vietnam. One of them stopped and shook Elvis's hand, and they started talking. Suddenly, Elvis nudged me. "Where's that money?" "It's safe," I said, reaching into my pocket. "But Elvis, this is our expense money." "Jerry, he's going home for Christmas," Elvis said, his voice soft but firm. I knew what he meant, and I handed the soldier the money, wishing him a Merry Christmas. On the flight, Elvis started writing a letter. He was using the pull-down tray as a desk, and he looked a bit woozy. He was writing to President Richard Nixon, expressing his concerns about the country and asking to be made a federal agent at large. He wanted to do something about the drug problem and the hippies. He believed he could make a difference. When we landed in Washington, it was early morning. Elvis insisted on dropping off his letter at the White House gates. We were penniless, but he didn't seem to care. After that, we went to the Hotel Washington to wait for Nixon's call. Later that day, I had to call a woman named Joyce Bova. "My name is Jerry Schilling," I said, "and I'm a friend of Elvis Presley. He's here in Washington, and he wants to see you." She was surprised, to say the least. "Put him on the phone," she said. Elvis took the phone and started talking. He told her he wanted to make things right, that he hadn't been himself the last time they met. He wanted her to forgive him. He even asked her to bring her twin sister, Janice. That night, Joyce and Janice came to the hotel. Elvis was dressed in his best Vegas does DC outfit: velvet coat, black suede suit, a massive gold belt, glittering chains, tinted sunglasses, and a cane. He looked like a king. He had a big day ahead, and he was determined to make it count. Elvis and Joyce talked for hours. He told her about his meeting with the president, about the badge he was going to get, and about his plans to help the country. She saw a side of him that was different, a side that was passionate and driven, but also vulnerable. As the night went on, Elvis and Joyce grew closer. She saw that he was a complex person, someone who wanted to make a difference, even if his methods were a bit unorthodox. He was a prince from another planet, and she was starting to understand why he was so special. Elvis's day had been long, but he was just getting started. He had a lot to do, and he was determined to do it all. And I was right there with him, ready to see where this wild ride would take us next. I flew to California in March to supervise the redecoration of the Montevideo house, while Elvis went to Nashville to meet with Felton Jarvis at RCA Studio B. Felton wanted a lot from him, this time a pop album, a holiday LP, a gospel record, and some singles. He hoped for a marathon session like before, but it wasn't to be. Elvis had folk songs on his mind, especially The First Time Ever I Saw Your Face by Ewan MacColl. At 1:30 a.m., usually a great time for him, he called off the session. He was having pain in his eye, probably from that infection he had in December. The next day his eye got worse, so he called Dr. Nick, who flew in with Dr. David Mayer, an eye doctor. Dr. Mayer first treated Elvis at his hotel, and then admitted him to Nashville's Baptist Memorial Hospital. He said Elvis had iritis, probably from the dye he used to color his eyelashes, and secondary glaucoma. Barbara Lee came to visit him, flying in from California. She stayed in the doctor's quarters when she wasn't in the hospital with him. I held his hand while they gave him a shot in the eye, but I looked away. He was brave and didn't make a sound. The word glaucoma made Elvis think he was going blind, so he had girlfriends fly in one at a time to stay with him. Later that spring, he invited her to Graceland. She loved seeing all his old Memphis hangouts and walking the Graceland grounds, but he scared her by playing chicken on the go-karts with his friend. She felt Gladys's presence around her, especially in Elvis's rooms where a picture of her stood on a table. Elvis spoke mostly of her when we were alone in his bedroom. He said Gladys had told him he would marry a brown-eyed girl and that he knew she would have liked me. He gave her Placidils to help her sleep, but she didn't want them and hid some in the sofa. One time he gave her a gray pill for a headache, and it made her really sick. Joyce also visited Graceland that spring. The same day Barbara left after Elvis's eye problem. Joyce came from the other side of the country and flew with him to Memphis. She held his hand while Dr. Mayer put the needle in his eye. Elvis was incoherent most of her visit, and the oxygen tank in Lisa Marie's room scared her. I couldn't understand why there was an oxygen tank for an eye problem. The doctor showed it to me, and I thought, oh my God, I hope I don't have to use this thing. Elvis wore a black eye patch for a while and smoked marijuana to ease the pain in his eye. He canceled his touring plans. Joyce came back to Tennessee on May 21st, when he was finishing a week-long recording session. But the next day, he woke up in pain with stomach cramps and insisted on flying home to Memphis. They drove straight to Dr. Nick's office from the airport, and suddenly he seemed fine. At the time, it seemed like Elvis had irritable bowel syndrome, but it was just the beginning of a more serious problem. He had a congenital megacolon, which meant his colon was much larger than normal and would eventually lose much of its ability to function. Elvis and I were in Palm Springs for our 4th wedding anniversary, and it was there that he threw caution to the wind. One weekend, the guys had a typical orgy, and one of the female guests sent a letter to the house addressed to Lizard Tongue. I found it and went ballistic. I called Joe in Vegas, demanding to talk to Elvis. Joe said Elvis was asleep, and when Elvis called back, he turned the tables on me, saying the letter was really for Sonny, not him. I apologized and called Son, his new wife, to tell her he was fooling around. During big arguments, Elvis played the tough part. Hey, you don't like it, here's the door. He was good at being defensive and great at screaming and yelling. It frightened me to the point where I wouldn't say anything more. He had a bad temper. I dealt with it by building my own life in California with Lisa Marie. I made new friends and started taking karate from Ed Parker. When I was in Memphis, I kept up my technique with Kang Ree, where Elvis studied Taekwondo. I also continued my dance classes, often at Sally O'Brien's studio. Pat West, Red's wife, went with me, and I'd take Lisa Marie to play with Sally's daughter, Paige, who was the same age. Sally thought I was a good dancer and missed few classes. She saw me as a warm and kind person. I needed normal time away from the spotlight. Some of my favorite moments with Elvis were when he'd come into Lisa's room and read her nursery rhymes, but those moments became fewer. One night in California, Elvis looked across the living room and saw how well I could do without him. "My," he said, "you've grown." That moment, I knew our marriage was over. For a while, I remained the token wife, staying at home while Elvis indulged with a bunch of girlfriends. Finally, I did what I felt I had to do. I took a lover, Mike Stone, the karate champ we had met in Hawaii. The guys knew about our affair before Elvis did. Henrietta, the maid, told Red that Mike was spending a lot of time at the house. Then Lisa Marie, who was 3, told a new entourage member that she saw Mommy and Mike wrestling in their sleeping bag on the beach all night. Sonny caught them in the shower at Montevideo. Nobody really blamed me. Joe understood that I wanted real love. I was at home, going out with my friends, taking karate with Mike, and then it all changed. But I waited for the right time to tell Elvis that I had chosen another man over him. He was already acting like he knew, but even if he didn't, he started taking bigger risks and showing less regard for his own life. He renewed contact with Day Amata at the Self-Realization Center and invited Larry Geller back into his life. He briefly looked into Scientology, but dismissed it as cultish and money-grubbing. Elvis's curiosity about Scientology led him to Peggy Lipton, an actress he found fascinating. He called her in July 1971 and invited her to his show at the Sahara Tahoe in Lake Tahoe, Nevada. He kissed like a god, Peggy wrote in her memoir, but that was about it. He didn't feel like a man next to me, more like a boy who'd never matured. Elvis came for her in a private plane. From the moment she stepped aboard, she knew it was a mistake. He looked like an action figure of himself, and he immediately offered her jewelry, which put her off. But he was smart and savvy, and she accepted a ring with little diamonds, rubies, and sapphires that could be moved to form any letter. She didn't know if he meant it for Presley or Peggy. After his show, they tried to make love but couldn't. He was too drugged up. The next morning, a doctor came and gave him a shot to help him sleep. He wanted her to have one too, but it scared her. She realized that being with him meant getting as stoned as he was, and all she wanted to do was run. One night, he woke up gagging and choking. She pulled him into a sitting position and turned on the light. His lap was covered in vomit and pills. He called for his mother, and she cleaned him up and held him until he fell back to sleep. After that, she stopped taking his calls. The way he lived was too frightening, and she had her own problems with cocaine. I wasn't going to be able to save him, nobody was. There were other close calls. During the Tahoe engagement, he picked up a teenage girl named Paige Peterson, and her mother let her stay with him. He gave her pills to keep up with his schedule. One night, they both nearly died. Sonny found them the next day, and Elvis's breathing was erratic. The Vicodin bottle was almost empty. A shot of Ritalin brought Elvis around, but Paige was in intensive care. Elvis picked up her medical bills, but didn't want to see her again. When Joyce attended his Vegas engagement in August, she was upset not to have been invited to Tahoe. She thought he was punishing her. He had the flu and wanted to be babied. They talked about Lisa Marie and Priscilla. Then Elvis said something that stopped her heart. She's a mama. She does the mothering. A mother is different. Once a woman has a child, it's a gift from God. It's God's way of telling her she's not a little girl anymore. Now it's time to be respected and all. I'm not sure I know what you mean, she replied. Well, he said, when a woman has a child, it changes her. She's grown up, you know. Now it's time to be respected and all. I couldn't believe what was happening. Elvis, the man I loved, the man I thought I knew, was becoming someone I didn't recognize. He was so controlling, always wanting to be in charge of everything, even my life. I felt like I was losing myself, and it scared me. One day, he came into the bathroom and showed me how he kept his voice in shape. He cupped water in his hands, inhaled it through his nose, and then spewed it out like a geyser. It was so out of character for him to be that open, and it made me feel uneasy. He even showed me his private parts, something he never did before. He said he wanted me to know he was clean, but it just freaked me out. Things got even stranger when a doctor came to our hotel room. Elvis asked the doctor to give me a shot, and I freaked out. I didn't want any part of it. I saw how the drugs were changing him, and I was scared for him. The next morning, he was cold and clammy, and I realized how dangerous it all was. Despite everything, Elvis could still be incredibly charming. One night, we went to a donut shop in a rough part of town. A bunch of kids surrounded the limo, but Elvis handled it like a pro. He showed them his fancy belt, and even pulled out a gun to play it up. It was so wild, but he was in control the whole time. That's the Elvis I fell in love with, the one who could command any room, but living with him was too much. He wanted to take over everything, and I needed my independence. I realized we were from two different worlds, and I didn't want to be part of his anymore. The night I decided to leave, I packed my things, took off the ring he gave me, and kissed his cheek for the last time. I knew it was the right choice, even though it broke my heart. Elvis was going through a lot. Priscilla was leaving him for another man, and it crushed him. He was so angry and hurt, but he didn't know how to deal with it. He turned to other women for comfort, but nothing was the same. He even recorded songs about heartbreak, like Always on My Mind. It was clear he was struggling, and I felt for him, but I couldn't stay. Even though I was gone, Elvis kept going. He had a huge show at Madison Square Garden, and it was a success. The New York Times called it a legendary performance. But I knew the real Elvis, the one who was struggling with drugs and losing control. I hoped he would find a way to get help, but I couldn't be there to see it. I had to take care of myself. I was still riding the high from the Madison Square Garden show, but the divorce from Priscilla hit me hard. On July 26, 1972, we officially separated. My lawyer, E. Gregory Hookstretton, drew up the papers, and Priscilla accepted the terms. A lump sum of $100,000, $1,000 a month for her expenses, and $500 for Lisa's child support. Even though she would later ask for more money, we always stayed close, especially for Lisa's sake. We acted like we were still together, hugging and saying things like, "Mommy said this," and "Daddy said that." It helped Lisa feel more stable. But I couldn't stop myself from acting recklessly. I'd ride my motorcycle around town, feeling terrible and looking worse. My face was round and distorted, and I'd often have a girl named Kathy Self with me. She was an exotic dancer and singer, and she looked a lot like Priscilla. We were seen together on Elvis Presley Boulevard, but it all ended quickly. On July 18, 1972, Kathy was killed in a car accident. Her mom said she got flowers and a huge orchid from me at her funeral. I felt guilty and sad. A few weeks later, I met Linda Thompson. She was different from the other girls. She was tall, had brown eyes, and a strong personality. She was a virgin and refused to change her hair color for me. But she understood me and saw that I needed more love and care than anyone else. She became the most important friend I had after Priscilla. I met Linda through a friend, and we hit it off right away. But while she was on a family vacation, I started seeing Sybil Shepherd. She was a beauty queen and an actress, and she reminded me of the Texas girls I used to date. We went to Graceland for chicken fried steak, and things got serious for a while. But she was already dating Peter Bogdanovich, and she chose him over me. She didn't like my lifestyle and the control I had over everything. I even tried to get her to take sleeping pills with me, but she refused and left. When I went to Vegas for a show, I brought Linda with me. She stayed for most of the engagement, and when she left, Sybil came in. But Sybil didn't fit in with my world, and she saw that I was different in Vegas. I had other women there too, and it was all too much for her. During the shows, some fans saw me differently. One fan, Robin Rosson, said I was like a drug. She went to all my shows and even got kisses and scarves from me. She became a well-known expert on Presley collectibles and formed a family with other fans. Some of them even chose me over their husbands. Larry Geller, my friend, and I talked a lot about love and loneliness. One morning, we were on the balcony of the Hilton, and I told him, "I can never know if a woman loves me or Elvis Presley." He said, "You've only had one real true love your fans." I knew he was right, and it was a heavy price to pay. The Colonel and RCA announced my next big project, Aloha from Hawaii, a live concert to be broadcast worldwide. It was a big deal, and I was excited. But sometimes I was affected by the drugs I was taking. My speech was slurred, and I perspired heavily. I was taking a mix of sedatives and painkillers, and it was getting worse. The Colonel never talked to Dr. Nick about my health problems. He just wanted to know how many shows we could do. I was nervous about the Aloha from Hawaii show. I wanted to prove I was still strong and didn't need anyone or anything to help me. I wanted to show Priscilla that I was fine without her. I even threw my jeweled cape into the audience, symbolizing a new beginning. But deep down, I was still a basket case, and I needed something to calm my nerves. It was a tough time, but I kept going, hoping to find some peace. Elvis hoped the Aloha special would impress his new girlfriend, Linda. I could tell she was different from the rest. She was always by his side, adored him deeply, and didn't try to change him. The only thing she wanted was to help him with his pills. When she went to Dr. Nick for advice, he told her to leave. But she chose to stay, and that made her special to Elvis. From the start, Linda knew Elvis was a complicated person. Their relationship was unique with many layers. Sometimes he called her Mommy, and she felt like his mother. Other times he acted like her father, and they were like children or siblings. They were also lovers. Linda understood all these sides of Elvis and embraced them. One of her main roles was taking care of him. The first time he took her to Vegas, Elvis passed out with food in his mouth and started choking. Linda saved him by clearing his throat and turning him on his side to help him breathe. She felt a strong responsibility to take care of him, not just for his mother, but for the world, because so many people loved him. Linda was very maternal and saw Elvis as her little boy. She called him Buntin, which means baby bunting, from a popular nursery rhyme. They often talked in baby talk, and it was a big part of their relationship. Linda was the only girlfriend who truly understood this secret language. Elvis and Linda rarely fought. Even when he saw other women, she stayed by his side. She knew that if she made a scene, he would just leave. For Christmas, Elvis gave her a fur coat, something every grown-up girl dreams of. In return, she let him regress to an infantile state, which helped him feel closer to his mother, Gladys. Ironically, the more childlike Elvis became, the more he treated his daughter, Lisa Marie, like an adult. He showered her with gifts, including a big, round bed with fake fur and a built-in radio. He often slept in it when Lisa was with her mother. During this time, Elvis was thinking a lot about Anne Margaret, the first girl he gave a round bed. In September, she fell from a platform and was seriously injured. Elvis sent her flowers and visited her to show his support. One night, he called her, expressing his feelings, but she couldn't be with him. As the Aloha concert approached, Elvis was very excited. He worked hard to get in shape, losing 25 pounds and following a strict diet. He collaborated with Bill Ballou to design a jumpsuit with an American eagle. The concert was a huge success, staying on the Billboard charts for 35 weeks and becoming his first #1 album in 9 years. After the show, Elvis bought diamond and emerald rings for all the wives and gave each of his friends $1,000. He had stayed off drugs for 2 weeks, but just before the concert, he asked for a vitamin B12 shot mixed with amphetamine. The next morning, he was stoned and couldn't go to the USS Arizona Memorial. When the special was broadcast in America, 57% of the TV audience watched it. It brought back memories for Joyce Bova, and she called Charlie to share the experience. Elvis called back and they talked. He invited her to California, but she didn't go. Elvis watched the show with Linda and Jerry. Over the next few weeks, he distanced himself from Jerry, who was going through a tough time in his marriage. Elvis confessed to sleeping with Jerry's girlfriend, which hurt Jerry deeply. Later, Jerry divorced his wife and married Mina Smith, but that relationship also ended. Being around Elvis was tough on marriages. Joe and Joni divorced, but Joe met Shirley Dia, and they became a strong couple. Elvis admired their relationship, but once tried to kiss Shirley. She avoided him and never accepted his advances. Elvis also had a complicated relationship with Angie Stanley, the wife of his stepbrother Billy. Billy wrote about their affair in his book, but Elvis claimed it didn't go beyond talking. Marty Lacker had a different view. 3 weeks after the Aloha concert, Elvis started his 8th Vegas engagement. He was tired and nostalgic. One night, Anita Wood came to see him. They embraced and talked for an hour, and Elvis wondered if they had made a mistake. Anita reassured him, but they both knew they would always love each other. Elvis was often in a daze, high on pills. One night, he thought some fans were sent to kill him and ordered a hit on Mike Stone. The guys calmed him down, but it was clear he was struggling. Priscilla wanted more money for the divorce, and Elvis was overextended. RCA offered to buy his master recordings for $3 million, but the Colonel negotiated it to $5,400,000. Of that, $6 million went to the Colonel, and $4,500,000 to Elvis. After taxes, Elvis saw only $2 million for his valuable recordings. By the time Elvis played at the Sahara Tahoe in May 1973, he was overweight and lethargic. He canceled several shows and went to a local hospital. The strain was obvious, and word spread throughout the industry. Barbara Eden, who was also performing, noticed how much he had changed. One morning in 1974, I woke up from a deep sleep, feeling groggy and confused. Linda was beside me, and I struggled to focus on her face. She looked exhausted, like she hadn't slept all night. The night before had been terrifying. I was eating some chicken soup for dinner, and Linda went to the bathroom to get ready for bed. When she came back, she found me face down in the hot soup, suffocating. She pulled me out and tried to revive me. When that didn't work, she called Dr. Nick, who rushed over and gave me a shot of Ritalin. When I woke up, I felt heavy and slow. "Mommy," I said, my voice thick. "Yes, honey," she replied softly. "I had a dream last night," I muttered. "I dreamed that you were my twin, and I came out first, but you smothered. You let me be born, but in the process, you died saving me." Linda looked at me with a chill. She tried to explain that I had trouble breathing, and she had to call Dr. Nick, but I didn't want to talk about that. I just wanted to talk about the dream. She told me it was just a dream, and I fell back asleep. Dr. Nick later told me that he didn't realize how bad off I was until the Demerol incident. He called the doctor in California who had given me the Demerol and told him I was very sick. The doctor admitted he had mixed some cortisone with the Novocaine, which might have made my condition worse. Dr. Nick consulted with addiction specialists who recommended putting me on phenobarbital to help with withdrawal symptoms. They also suggested methadone, which is usually used for heroin addiction. Dr. Nick brought in Dr. Larry Rubble, a gastroenterologist, who found that I had a bowel problem and my colon was packed with fecal material. I also had arthritis in my neck and back, and my liver was damaged from long-term medication abuse. Dr. Nick asked me to cut out certain songs and movements from my shows to avoid aggravating my condition. Linda stayed by my side in the hospital, sleeping on a cot beside me. We watched a lot of TV, especially game shows. At night, after the Memphis station signed off, we watched The Little Indian Head and listened to High Flight, the pilot's creed. We even watched closed-circuit images of babies in the nursery, and pretended we were looking for our own child. We had silly games and fantasies about having a kid together. I wanted a son, and we talked about what he would look like and what we would call him. Sometimes I would regress and act like a baby, and Linda would have to baby me too. It was our way of coping. When I got out of the hospital, Dr. Nick and Joe searched my bedroom and threw out large bottles of pills, but I refused to go into any deep discussions with the addiction specialists. I didn't want anyone digging into my head. At home, one of the problems was getting me to take a regular bath. I would just eat Nello tablets to mask any body odor. Dr. Nick would visit every night, and we felt like a team, me, Dr. Nick, and Linda working to get me back on track. When I went back to Vegas in January 1974, the critics said I was back on form, but Dr. Nick suggested cutting the engagement from 4 weeks to 2 to reduce the number of shows and the amount of medication I needed. The Colonel didn't like this idea because it meant less money, but Dr. Nick was trying to help me. Dr. Gainham, another doctor who prescribed me a lot of medication, was less helpful. When Dr. Gainham was around, things got worse. Dr. Nick was better at keeping things under control. It was a tough time, but I was slowly getting better. Linda and Dr. Nick were there for me, and that made all the difference. I was nervous as can be when I first met Elvis. I mean, the guy was my hero. We were at RCA Studios in Los Angeles, and I was there to audition for the spot of bass player in his band. I had no idea what to expect, but I was determined to do my best. We ran through a few songs for about an hour, and then during the break, I found myself standing next to Elvis. He had a big, nickel-plated pistol, and he pulled it out of his belt, handing it to one of the guys. I tried to make conversation, thinking it might ease the tension. "I know you have a lot of martial arts training," I said, "so I was wondering why you carry a gun." Elvis sort of curled his lip and said, "That's to handle anything from 6 feet out. 6 feet in, I got it covered." I was thinking about that when he turned to walk away. Then out of nowhere, he spun around and threw a punch. It stopped just an inch from my nose. I didn't even see it coming, but it left me with a red face and a racing heart. He could have really hurt me, but he was just showing off, I guess. Things got even weirder once we got to Vegas. Elvis was becoming more and more unpredictable. One night, he shot out a chandelier in his suite. Another night, he fired randomly because he couldn't find Dr. Gainham. I remember this one time, he was trying to shoot a porcelain owl with a .22 caliber revolver. Linda was in the bathroom, and the bullet tore through the wall. nicked the toilet paper holder, and shattered a hanging mirror. She was shaken but kept her cool. She said it was crazy, but he didn't take it as casually as some people thought. He was just having a little target practice, but he was really upset. The Colonel invited Bob Finkel, the executive producer of the '68 special, to one of Elvis's shows. Afterward, Joe took Bob and his wife, Jane, up the private elevator to the penthouse. They were left alone to go in by themselves. When Bob opened the door, the suite was pitch black, except for the light from the television. Elvis was sitting there, and all he said was, "Hi, Bob." Then he fired at the television with a pistol. Bob and Jane got right back in the elevator and left. It was scary. One day at Graceland, Elvis was eating breakfast, and Robert Goulet appeared on the TV. It brought back bad memories for Elvis. He remembered how Anita Wood had gone on tour with Goulet when he was in Germany. Goulet had written a postscript on a letter to Anita, something like, "Hey Elvis, don't worry, I'm taking pretty good care of Anita." It was just a joke, but it always bothered Elvis. He got so angry that he pulled out his .22 and shot a hole through the TV. Then he calmly picked up his utensils and said, "That'll be enough of that shit." Elvis's drug use was getting worse in Vegas. It was like a trap for him. He'd get wasted to avoid dealing with it. "It's better to be unconscious than miserable," he'd say with a dark sense of humor. At home, he could just sleep for days. But in Vegas, he had to get up for the shows. It was a never-ending cycle of uppers and downers. Sometimes he'd get so high that he almost died. Nick had to shoot him to knock him out when he was too wired. Being with him was like being in a firehouse. You never knew when the alarm was going to go off. During that Vegas engagement, Elvis met Ann Pennington. She was a model and actress, and her older sister, Janice, was on The Price is Right. They shared the same dentist, who called Ann and said Elvis was going through a rough patch after his divorce and needed to meet some nice girls. Ann was more of a Beatles fan and didn't want to go, but Janice went and told Ann she had to meet him. When Ann finally went over, Joe opened the door, and there was Elvis in a green leisure suit. He was charming, and they had a great time. Ann had a 3-year-old daughter, Jessica, but Elvis was already interested in her. When he found out she was a mother, he was surprised but then became comfortable with it. They bathed Jessica and Lisa together in the tub, and he played with Ann's daughter and spoiled her with candy. They read books and had deep conversations. He'd play Blue Spanish Eyes for her on his guitar and talk about how lonely he felt. Ann understood that feeling. She was new in L.A. and didn't know many people. They had a lot in common. One night, they were sitting around on bar stools with the guys, and Elvis brought out a joint. It was Ann's first time smoking grass, and they laughed so hard they fell off their chairs. But another night, after a few drinks, Ann woke up freezing in her negligee. She was soaked and just moved to the edge of the bed. When Elvis got up, he was mortified. He said, "Oh my God, Annie Pie, I'm so sorry. Why didn't you wake me?" He talked about it with the guys, but no one said much more after the maids took the mattress out of the suite. Linda found out about Ann, but didn't think they were really together. She had her own inkling that Elvis was with other women, like Sherry Williams, who came to Palm Springs with the group. Linda was away with a friend, and Sherry spent a week at Graceland. Linda felt it was a violation of their relationship. She grew more aware of her own needs and what Elvis could and could not give her. They had planned to get married, but the timing was bad. They were together for a long time, but it was a transitional relationship. Elvis also hit on other girls in front of Linda, including Sheila Ryan, who arrived in Vegas around the same time as Ann. Joe brought her backstage, and Elvis threw a grape at her from across the room, hitting her right between the eyes. She thought it was a mistake until she saw Elvis and Joe laughing. He came over, apologized, and asked her to come up to his suite. She was a virgin, a Catholic girl from Chicago, and she had self-esteem issues. Men were always drawn to her, but she didn't understand why. When she went up to Elvis's suite, he was dripping wet with sweat and had a white towel. He made a comment about her wearing slacks, and she told him, "Does Cruella know you have her cape tonight?" referring to his stage outfit. They had a connection, and it was a different side of Elvis. He was vulnerable, and she understood him in a way that others didn't. "I never imagined my life could twist and turn like this." Here I was, Sheila, a girl from nowhere, suddenly thrown into the world of Elvis Presley, the king of rock and roll. It was a wild ride, filled with laughter, surprises, and a lot of confusion. When Elvis and I first met, I was just trying to hold my own, making him laugh with my quick wit and spunk. He was nervous, but I could tell he was intrigued. The first night, we spent hours talking, singing, and just being silly. I remember him asking me if I believed in love at first sight. I didn't know what to think back then, but I was definitely drawn to him. Elvis had a way of making you feel special, like you were the only one in the room. He gave me a beautiful necklace with his initials and a star, and he put on a fireman's hat, pretending to be a baby. It was a strange moment, but I knew he needed someone to take care of him, and I was willing to be that person. Our relationship wasn't always smooth. There were moments when he would ask me to do things that made me uncomfortable, like giving him injections. It was a side of him I wasn't prepared for, but I understood that he was dealing with a lot of pain and pressure. Despite the challenges, we had fun together. We wrestled on the bed, had pillow fights, and he told me stories that kept me laughing. When we did get intimate, it was a mix of tenderness and awkwardness. He was shy at first, but once he got going, he was all in. I learned a lot about love and trust from him, even though I was pretty naive at the time. But our relationship wasn't just about me. There were other women in his life, like Linda Thompson, who was a big part of his world. I remember the first time I heard him on the phone with her, and it was clear that she could really push his buttons. It was a rude awakening, but it also made me realize that Elvis was a complex person with a lot of different relationships. Linda and I even ran into each other in the Las Vegas airport once. It was awkward, but we both knew the score. Elvis was a man who wanted it all, and sometimes that meant having more than one woman in his life. After our time together, I moved to Los Angeles and tried to move on. Elvis and Linda reconciled, and for a while it seemed like they were the ones who were meant to be. But even then, Elvis was always searching for something more. He asked his friend Larry to set him up with other women, and one night he ended up with Judy, Larry's sister. It was another chapter in his life, and I knew it was time for me to find my own path. Looking back, I'm grateful for the time I spent with Elvis. He taught me a lot about love, about being yourself, and about the importance of laughter. Even though our relationship wasn't perfect, it was a part of my journey, and I wouldn't trade those memories for anything.